Now back on British soil, there's been a warrant issued by Chelmsford Magistrates Court in relation to the murder of Robert Powell. So therefore I'm writing you under that warrant just to murder. Okay? You do not say anything, but may have a defence to mention when questions later on in court. Anything you do say may be given evidence. And the time is 20:43. Can you get straight inside? I think it's a bit warmer in plane. Back here. So I'll take a step over here,
Saturday, 13th of June 2020, just before 5 a.m, in the quiet village of Roydon, Essex, the night was finally starting to die down. A private party was ending, music muffled behind closed doors, the street outside almost empty. A man stepped out with his 2 adult sons, laughing, unaware that every movement was being watched. Seconds later, the calm shattered. A car rolled past, slowing almost to a stop. The passenger door opened, and the first flash lit up the road, then another, and another. 8 shots in total, echoing off the houses, followed by the sound of feet scrambling, engines roaring, and then silence. By the time detectives arrived, one name was already circulating in hushed, angry conversations. A name they'd been chasing for years. A man who knew exactly how to vanish. And he wasn't the only one. Because this wasn't the first time a British street had turned into a killing ground. 2 years earlier, in broad daylight, on an ordinary Wednesday in Ashton-under-Lyne, Greater Manchester, another ambush exploded into violence. 5 shots were fired into a van on a residential street. One man died where he sat. Another was left bleeding beside him. It was no random act. It was a message killing in the middle of a turf war. From that moment, 2 manhunts would begin to gather pace. One in the south, one in the north. 2 fugitives, 2 executions, and investigations that would stretch from Manchester to Morocco, from cramped safe houses in Spain to a guarded courtroom in London. This is the story of those who ran and the relentless hunt that brought them home. Welcome to UK crime documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. Long before the name Nana Oppong appeared on any most wanted list, it was already travelling through East London's underworld, spoken with a mix of respect and unease. To detectives, he was a committed, high-level criminal. To those who knew him, he was the man who always walked free, the one who somehow slipped through every set of handcuffs that closed around him. His reputation really began to harden in May 2010, on the night of his own birthday celebration at the Sugar Lounge venue. What was meant to be a night of champagne and celebration ended with blood on the pavement. Outside the club, a shootout broke out between rival groups. 2 men, Eugene Brown and Patrick Ford, were gunned down in the street. A third, Michael Smith, was shot 6 times, including once in the head, and left fighting for his life. Oppong was accused of arming one of the gunmen and pointing out the victims moments before the attack. Twice he stood trial for murder. Twice juries failed to reach a verdict. The murder charges slipped away. By 2012, the only thing that stuck was a conviction for perverting the course of justice after he lied to police about his role that day. He served 2 years, then walked free. Again. But violence had a way of circling back to him. In May 2014, at a birthday party in Dagenham, a young father named Ashley Latty was beaten and stabbed to death outside a community hall. Witnesses described a frenzied assault, kicking, punching, stabbing in a blur of panic and rage. Among those charged was Nana Oppong. Once more he faced a murder count. Once more he sidestepped it. He admitted only grievous bodily harm with intent and served a short 4-year term before hitting the streets again. To police, it had become a pattern. Whenever serious violence erupted, Oppong's name was there somewhere in the paperwork, never pulling the trigger, but never far from those who did. By the late 2010 seconds, detectives quietly called him the Teflon Don, a man steeped in drugs, guns, and revenge, who never seemed to stick to the crimes that surrounded him. In 2020, that illusion would finally crack, and this time, there would be no walking free. Robert Powell was not a gangster in the way police were used to seeing on the streets. He wasn't a young street soldier fighting over corners or a masked gunman riding on scooters. At 50 years old, he was a father of 3, a grandfather of 2, and a familiar face in London's music circles. To most people, he was simply Fox, a man who knew everyone, the kind of figure you'd see backstage, on the phone, making things happen. Powell managed talent, connected artists, and navigated that grey area where the world of show business overlaps with the world of serious money. He had worked with several up-and-coming names, including rapper Dutchie, whose rising profile drew in investors, promoters, and people with enemies. In that world, reputation was currency. One rumor could cost you business. One insult could cost you your life. By 2020, the line between the music scene and organized crime had blurred more than ever. Money from drugs and fraud washed through clubs, events, and management companies. Arguments about payments or respect weren't always settled in meetings, they were settled in alleyways and car parks. Somewhere in this overlap, Powell's name drifted into the orbit of Nana Oppong's network, a group long associated with Class A drugs and violent disputes. Detectives would later tell the court they believed Oppong carried a personal grievance against Powell, something more than casual bad blood. Whether it began as a business disagreement, an unpaid debt, a perceived slight, or some unseen power play, no one outside that circle can say for sure. What detectives were certain of was far simpler and far more chilling. By early June 2020, Robert Fox Powell had been marked. In the weeks before the shooting, friends said Powell seemed cautious. He knew people were talking. He knew certain names were circling in conversations he didn't like. But like many men who've spent years around high-risk people and high-risk money, he also believed he could read danger and dodge it. No one expected an execution outside a party in a sleepy Essex village at dawn. Behind the scenes, a plan was already forming. Encrypted messages later recovered showed that Oppong and his associates were tracking Powell's movements, looking for the right place and the right time. As early as the 5th of June 2020, they were ready to strike. That night, the proposed target was a block party in Beckton, East London. The tone of the messages suggested anticipation. The team was poised. But as the night unfolded, something spooked Oppong. Too many uniforms about, too much heat. He pulled the plug. The job wasn't cancelled. It was postponed. 8 days later, in the late hours of the 12th of June 2020, Powell arrived at a private party in Roydon, Essex, just outside Harlow. It was a low-key celebration, music, food, familiar faces. A place people went to relax, not look over their shoulders. Inside, the mood was easy. Outside, the streets were quiet, but not empty. At a distance, 3 vehicles were moving with purpose. A Ford Cougar, a Vauxhall Zafira, and a Toyota Prius. The Prius, driven by Isra Shah, acted as the eyes circling, watching, feeding information. The Zafira carried additional crew, backup if anything went wrong. The Cougar, wearing cloned plates, was the designated strike vehicle. CCTV from nearby homes and businesses would later show the convoy circling the area multiple times in the hour before the shooting. They weren't lost. They were waiting, watching doors, checking exits, timing the moment when Robert Powell would finally step outside into the cool early morning air, thinking the night was over. In reality, for Powell, it was already decided. In the early hours of Saturday, 13th June 2020, that moment finally came. Inside the private venue, the birthday celebrations were winding down. Guests hugged goodbye, voices low and tired after a long night. At around 4:45 a.m., Robert Powell walked out into the cool air with his 2 adult sons. The street on Water Lane was calm, lit by a few street lamps and the pale hint of dawn. From a distance, the Ford Cougar began to crawl forward. As Powell and his sons moved toward a Ford Mondeo parked nearby, the Cougar slowed almost to a stop. The passenger door swung open and a man stepped out, face obscured, arm raised. In his hand, a 9mm pistol. What followed took just seconds. 8 shots ripped through the quiet. Muzzle flashes lit up the street as the gunman fired in rapid succession. Powell was hit multiple times, collapsing to the ground beside the parked Mondeo. His sons scrambled for cover, shouting for help. One of the bullets tore away from the main line of fire, traveling down the roadside where it struck 2 women passing through one and embedding itself in the ankle of another. Then, as quickly as it started, it was over. The gunman jumped back into the Cougar. The engine roared and the strike vehicle sped off, followed by the Vauxhall Zafira and the Toyota Prius that had been lurking nearby. By the time the first witnesses ran into the street, the convoy was already disappearing into the dark, taillights fading. When the first 999 calls came in, Essex police and paramedics raced to the scene. They found what officers would later describe as a textbook sign of a planned, targeted killing. Robert Powell lay motionless on the road. 8 9mm shell casings were scattered across Waterlane, their placement and pattern revealing careful aim rather than wild panic. This wasn't a drunken argument gone too far. It was an execution. Detectives from the Serious Crime Directorate were called in. Their first move was to lock down the area and start building a timeline. CCTV from houses, pubs, and garages around Roydon was pulled and reviewed frame by frame. Very quickly, the same 3 vehicles began to stand out. The Cougar, the Zafira, the Prius, circling, looping, approaching and retreating in the hour before the shooting. Automatic number plate recognition cameras across Essex helped trace the convoy, leaving Roydon, heading through Epping and then out of the county entirely. When officers ran the plates on the Cougar, they hit their first wall. The registrations were cloned. On paper, the car didn't exist. Still, small details began to join up. The same vehicles had been spotted days earlier, near addresses in East London, linked to a familiar name, Nana Oppong. Forensic specialists worked the scene. The 9mm shell casings were collected and compared to intelligence about ammunition types being discussed on encrypted devices used by known criminals. Separately, raids on garages and lockups associated with Oppong Circle produced traces of gunshot residue. At another address, investigators found phones they would later connect to EncroChat handles communicating directly with Oppong in the days before the shooting. By late June, a picture had formed. Oppong, 43, from Stratford in East London, was identified as the suspected organizer and likely the gunman. Alongside him, 40-year-old Ira Shah from Brentwood was believed to be the lookout in the Prius, relaying information as the convoy circled. A third man, Associate Tetopi Timitopi Adanuga, was tied in through phone records and CCTV, seen moving in and out of vehicles connected to the operation before and after the killing. Detectives believed these 3 formed the core of the team that executed the ambush on Waterlane. Armed with that belief, they moved. Warrants were issued. Addresses across London and Essex were hit in a series of coordinated raids. Garages were searched, phones seized, vehicles examined. But when officers finally kicked in the doors they had been watching, one detail cut through all the effort. The men they wanted were gone. When the raids came up empty, it felt, briefly, like history was repeating itself. Once again, Nana Oppong's name was on the file. Once again, he wasn't in the dock. This time, though, detectives had something they'd never had before. A secret doorway into the encrypted world he trusted. By mid-2020, the traditional leads were fading fast. The murder weapon had not been found. The cars were burned out, cleaned, or vanished. Witnesses were understandably nervous. What Oppong and his associates didn't know was that, quietly, EncroChat, the supposedly unbreakable encrypted phone network used by thousands of criminals across Europe, had already been compromised. Inside that system, one handle caught investigators' attention: ENS. Whoever controlled that account spoke with authority. He gave instructions. He discussed logistics. He talked about the thing in Essex, like someone who knew exactly what had happened and why. Another handle, Slick, was in constant contact with him, asking questions, venting frustration, arranging meetups. Digital detectives began to map these conversations. Piece by piece, they built a bridge from anonymous handles to real people. Phone locations lined up with known addresses. Contacts overlapped with existing intelligence. Eventually, the picture became too sharp to ignore. ENS, they concluded, was Nana Oppong. Slick was Isra Shah. The chat logs rewound the story of the Roydon shooting. In early June, ENS was seen ordering 9mm ammunition, asking about delivery times and confirming payment. On the 5th of June, the night the Beckton block party hit was aborted, Slick messaged, "How do we plan to do this? I'm sick of the acting, bro." It was the voice of a lookout who'd been told to stand down, restless and impatient. Then, silence. The plan went dark until the early hours of the 13th of June. On the night Robert Powell was killed, the timestamps on EncroChat messages aligned almost perfectly with CCTV, showing the convoy arriving in Roydon. In the hours immediately after the shooting, ENS deleted large chunks of his chat history and sent one final note: "All clear. Handle your side." 2 days later, Oppong's handset was wiped remotely. but the damage was already done. Mirrored copies of the data had been captured during the EncroChat breach and preserved. For the first time, investigators had direct digital proof tying him and Shah to the orchestration of the hit. The man who'd been dubbed the Teflon Don had finally left fingerprints he couldn't scrub away. With that breakthrough, the case shifted from a national inquiry to an international manhunt. Detectives now knew exactly who they were looking for. They just didn't know where he was. Within days of the Roydon shooting, Oppong had slipped out of the UK using false documents, moving through ports that saw thousands of faces every day. Intelligence suggested he'd traveled into Spain, drifting between safe houses linked to drug traffickers. From there, the trail pointed south, towards Morocco. Shah had also gone to ground in Spain, living under aliases, swapping burner phones, keeping his footprint as light as possible. As for Tetepi Adenuga, he simply disappeared. Detectives believed he may have used forged West African documents to vanish off the grid entirely. By late 2021, the National Crime Agency and Essex Police had pooled their efforts into an international task force. Interpol red notices were issued, instructing foreign forces to arrest the men on site. Oppong's history, 2 failed murder trials, links to drug trafficking and firearms pushed him up the priority list. In 2022, his face went public on a Europe-wide Most Wanted campaign. He must have believed he could ride it out. In September 2022, at Tangier port in Morocco, officers checking vehicles off a ferry from Spain spotted a Maltese passport that didn't quite match the man holding it. When they ran his fingerprints, alarms began to ring. The man was identified as Nana Oppong. After 2 years on the run, he hadn't been taken down by a rival crew or dramatic dawn raid, just routine border control. He was arrested and held by Morocco's General Directorate for National Security. His capture was kept quiet while extradition papers moved slowly between Rabat and London. 9 months of legal arguments, signatures, diplomatic cables, and waiting followed. In June 2023, Oppong was finally flown back to the UK. Bodycam footage released later showed him handcuffed in the back of a van, calm, blank-faced, nodding as officers read out the charges. The man who'd spent a decade dodging murder convictions was back where it had all started. Just weeks earlier, his co-accused, Isra Shah, had already been returned. Spanish police had arrested him near Alicante in December 2022 after months of surveillance on a modest flat. Shah didn't resist. By March 2023, he was on a flight to Britain under heavy security. In May 2024, both men finally stood trial at Woolwich Crown Court. The courtroom was full. Detectives, prosecutors, and Robert Powell's family, who had waited 4 long years for justice. The prosecution laid out the case. EncroChat messages, CCTV, forensics, phone data. Oppong denied it all, insisting he wasn't ENS. Shah admitted being there but claimed he was only dealing drugs, not planning murder. Both tried to push blame onto Adenuga, still wanted by police. The jury didn't buy it. On 28 May 2024, both men were found guilty of murder and possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. Oppong was also convicted of grievous bodily harm for the injuries to the 2 women hit by the stray bullet. The sentences were heavy. Life imprisonment for both. A minimum of 38 years for Oppong, 26 for Shah. For the first time, the Teflon Don wasn't walking away. While detectives in Essex and the NCA were tracking Oppong across borders, another story of cold, calculated violence was unfolding further north. A story that began 2 years earlier on a bright summer afternoon in Greater Manchester. From the outside, Ashton-under-Lyne looked like any other suburban town. Terraced houses, family cars, kids playing out on the street. But underneath that normality, detectives knew there was a different map entirely. A map of rival organized crime groups dealing in Class A drugs, carving up Tameside street by street. At the center of one of those networks was 3 one-year-old Luke Graham. He was a father of 2, embedded in a local crew supplying cocaine and cannabis around Ashton. He wasn't a kingpin, but he wasn't a nobody either. In court, prosecutors would later describe him as part of a structured operation, earning serious money from an illegal trade. Opposite him on that map was another name, Wade Cox. Cox, then 34, ran a rival outfit. His operation was bigger, better financed, and according to the judge, ready to use extreme violence to keep control. His crew had links that stretched beyond Tameside into wider organized crime across Manchester. Where Luke Graham's group was local and scrappy, Cox's was organized and unforgiving. The two sides were in the same business, in the same area, at the same time. It was only a matter of time before friction turned into open hostility. That hostility began to show in 2018. There were rumors of territory being encroached on, customers being poached, debts not being honored. Texts and intercepted conversations, later shown in court, revealed an escalation in tone talk of sorting, the problem of dealing with it once and for all. At Cox's side during all this was 20-something enforcer and trusted associate, Callum Halpin. He wasn't the one calling the shots at the top, but he was the one expected to carry them out, to make sure that when Cox sent a message, it was heard loud and clear. Behind them were other men whose names would later appear on a charge sheet. Drivers, fixers, the ones who stole cars, set fires, and provided alibis. Not the ones who pulled the trigger, but the ones who made it possible. We'll come back to them. By June 2018, the tension had stopped being just talk. Plans were being laid. According to investigators, Cox's group had decided that Luke Graham was no longer just a rival. He was a problem that needed to be removed. The way they chose to do it was as simple as it was cruel. They picked someone Luke knew. A local drug user known on the streets as Peanut, a man Graham occasionally supplied. Peanut became the bait. Word was passed along that Peanut was in trouble, that rival dealers were threatening him near a house on Birch Street, Ashton-under-Lyne. For a lot of people, that might have sounded suspicious, but loyalty and impulsiveness can be a deadly mix. Graham decided he wasn't going to leave one of his own to be intimidated. On the afternoon of Wednesday, 13th of June 2018, he headed to Birch Street to sort it. He wasn't alone. With him was his close friend, 7-year-old Anton Verigota. They pulled up just after 4:40 p.m. in a white Volkswagen Caddy, driving into what looked like an ordinary residential street. Children were playing. Neighbors were pottering about. Nothing about Birch Street, at first glance, looked like the stage for an execution. But just out of sight, the trap was already set. Minutes before the Caddy arrived, CCTV had captured a stolen Audi A3 turning into Birch Street. Inside, according to police, were Wade Cox, Callum Halpin, and another associate. The Audi crawled along the road and then stopped a few doors away from the address Peanut was supposedly at. Inside that house, Cox and Halpin waited. When Luke Graham climbed out of the van to check on Peanut, he had no idea that the call for help was fake. No idea that as he spoke near the end house, the men who wanted him dead were watching every move. Soon, he would walk back towards the van, climb into the passenger seat beside his friend, and shut the door. And at that moment, on a quiet suburban street, the plan to sort it would turn into a ruthless public execution. Birch Street, that Wednesday afternoon, looked ordinary. The kind of place where you'd expect to see kids riding bikes and neighbors chatting over garden fences, not gunmen stepping out of stolen cars. Luke Graham and Anton Verigota pulled up in the white VW Caddy just after 4:40 p.m. Graham got out first, heading towards the house where Peanut was supposed to be in trouble. For a few moments, everything looked normal. He spoke briefly near the end of the street, unaware that inside that same house, hidden from view, were the very men who'd engineered the whole situation, Wade Cox and Callum Halpin. The call for help had been a lie. The trap was real. When Graham turned back and climbed into the passenger seat of the Caddy, he thought he was leaving. He shut the side door. Verigota was at the wheel. They were moments away from just driving off. That's when Halpin struck. He suddenly appeared at the van, reached for the sliding side door and slammed it shut with force, making sure they couldn't move. At that exact moment, from just a few feet away, Wade Cox raised a handgun and aimed through the window. 5 shots. The glass exploded. Bullets ripped through the cab. 3 of them struck Luke Graham, killing him almost instantly. Another hit Verigota, leaving him badly injured, but miraculously still alive. The whole ambush took less than a minute from the moment Graham returned to the van. Then came the chaos. Neighbors later described the sound of tires screeching as the stolen Audi. A 3, the same one caught on CCTV earlier, tore away from the scene. Screams rang out. Children who had been playing outside were rushed indoors. People peered from behind curtains, then ducked back in fear. When paramedics and Greater Manchester police arrived, they were met with a scene that would haunt many of them. Luke Graham was slumped in the driver's area of the van, motionless. Despite desperate attempts to save him, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Verigota, gravely injured, was rushed to hospital but survived. Detectives from the major incident team knew immediately this wasn't a random shooting. The precision, the timing, the use of a stolen vehicle, it was classic organized crime. They launched an inquiry codenamed Operation Cranbrook. Forensic teams began the meticulous work. Every shard of glass, every cartridge case, every trace of blood was collected and catalogued. Ballistic experts confirmed the bullets were 9mm, the same caliber frequently seen in firearms linked to organized crime across Tameside and Manchester. Meanwhile, CCTV and ANPR cameras began to tell their own story. Footage from Ashton town centre through to nearby areas showed the stolen Audi A3's movements before and after the murder. Cameras tracked it heading away from Birch Street towards Gorton, around 6 miles away. Less than an hour after the shooting, residents in Gorton reported seeing smoke rising from a quiet back street. When fire crews arrived, they found a car engulfed in flames. Once the fire was out, forensics examined what was left. It was the Audi A3. Every trace of evidence inside the fingerprints, the fibers, the gunshot residue had been destroyed in the blaze. But the killers hadn't vanished as cleanly as they hoped. Using cell site data, investigators plotted which phones had been active in key locations. Patterns emerged. Devices associated with Wade Cox and Callum Halpin appeared to move in tandem in the hours leading up to the shooting and again in the immediate aftermath. Text messages and call logs showed communication spikes before and after the ambush, followed by hurried changes of handsets. Some of the men around Cox weren't as careful. Over the following months, arrests were made across Greater Manchester. Lower-level associates were picked up, those involved in stealing the Audi, arranging its disposal, and helping coordinate travel and alibis. Drivers, fixers, and lie spinners, each of them a small but vital cog in the machine that killed Luke Graham. Some were even intercepted at airports, trying to leave the country as the net closed in. The case against Cox and his inner circle grew stronger. Still, one name remained frustratingly out of reach. Before officers could move in on him, one man had already gone. His name was Callum Halpin, and for the next 4 years, he would live like a ghost. When Callum Halpin slipped away, it added a new layer to an already chilling case. Greater Manchester Police knew who they believed had stood at that van door on Birch Street. They had eyewitness accounts, phone data, and a clear motive. What they didn't have was Halpin himself. Operation Cranbrook widened. Detectives traced his last known movements through border checks, travel records, and financial traces. By late 2018, they discovered what they'd feared. Halpin had left the UK. From there, the trail wound across Europe. He didn't travel like a tourist. Investigators believed he used forged documents and criminal contacts to move quietly, avoiding anything that would require his real identity. Intelligence later suggested he had gravitated towards Spain's Costa del Sol, an area long associated with British fugitives who disappear into expat bars, rented apartments, and networks of organized crime. At one stage, he was thought to have been living alongside another wanted man, drug trafficker Alex Mail, who was himself on the run for major importation offences. It was a reminder of how closely connected these criminal worlds can be. Different cases, same safe havens. Back in the UK, the wheels of justice kept turning without him. In 2019, at Manchester Crown Court, the first trial over Luke Graham's murder went ahead. Sitting in the dock was Wade Cox, the man prosecutors said had pulled the trigger, along with several associates accused of helping him afterwards. Christopher Atkinson, Kane Cornforth, Dean Dodd, and Ryan West. The jury heard about the trap laid with Peanut, the ambush on Birch Street, the burning of the Audi, and the frantic phone activity before and after the shooting. When the verdicts came back, they were damning. Cox was found guilty of murder and grievous bodily harm against Anton Verigota. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 36 years. The men who'd supported him didn't escape justice either. Christopher Atkinson, 33, from Manchester, received 5 years in prison for assisting an offender. Kane Cornforth, 29, from Gorton, was given 7 years for his leading role in destroying the getaway car and helping to arrange false alibis. Dean Dodd, 29, from Openshaw, got 4 years for perverting the course of justice after he tried to mislead investigators in the early days of the inquiry. Ryan West, 30, from Droylsden, was sentenced to 2 years and 6 months for assisting an offender. But one chair in that courtroom remained empty. Halpin's. By 2021, his absence had become a symbol of unfinished business. The National Crime Agency and Crime Stoppers placed him on a new list of the UK's most wanted fugitives as part of Operation Captura. His photograph appeared on posters and news sites from Manchester to Malaga, describing him as dangerous, violent, and believed to be armed. The message was clear. He could run, but he wouldn't be forgotten. On May 30th, 2022, that long pursuit finally came to an end. Acting on intelligence from the NCA and GMP, Spanish police surrounded a property near Alicante. Inside, they found Halpin, trying to disguise his appearance, hiding in a modest apartment. There was no dramatic shootout. He offered no resistance as armed officers arrested him under a European arrest warrant for the murder of Luke Graham and the attempted murder of Anton Verigota. After months of legal wrangling, Halpin was extradited back to the UK in early 2023. The ghost was back in the land of the living, and now he had to face what happened on Birch Street. His trial at Manchester Crown Court would echo the earlier case. Halpin denied everything, insisting he was nowhere near the scene that June afternoon. But the evidence built against him the same way it had for Cox: CCTV, phone data, witness accounts, and the broader pattern of the feud. The judge called it what it was: a public execution carried out in pursuit of control and fear. On 17th February 2023, Halpin was found guilty of murder and grievous bodily harm. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years. 2 stories, 2 different parts of the country, but the pattern is painfully familiar. Men who believed their networks, their reputations, and their willingness to use violence would keep them safe. Men who thought they could vanish across borders or hide in the shadows of nightlife and drug money. In the end, they were brought down by persistence, technology, and time. EncroChat breaches, CCTV grids, international task forces, patient detectives following tiny fragments of data across continents. For the families of Robert Fox, Powell, and Luke Graham, no sentence can undo what happened. But the message these cases send is clear. You can run, you can hide, you can burn the car and throw away the phone. But eventually, someone will knock on the door. What do you think of the sentences and the way these investigations unfolded? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this breakdown informative, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK crime documentaries.